Bank says I need a wife. We tell her to keep this land.
I'm your housekeeper, not your bride, Mr. McCord.
Widowed rancher needed a wife to keep his land, but the only one left was the housekeeper, Lot 18. The wind of Deadwood Creek, Arizona, in 1876, blew through the dense snow, bringing a bone-chilling cold and the smell of the end of the world. It whistled through the gaunt desert trees, seeping into every crack of the log cabin, carrying the howl of a wolf somewhere far away. Even in the kitchen, where the fire was still crackling weakly, I felt a chill down my spine. The heavy scent of dry wood, horse sweat, and tobacco smoke hung in the air. This place, and all it represented, had witnessed too much silence. I stood in front of the fireplace. The flames burned down to nothing but embers glowing red, like small eyes watching my every move. Flickering light danced on the walls, stretching my shadow into a distorted shape, trembling with every gust of wind slipping through the window's cracks. I folded an old wool blanket, its edges frayed and loose as if ready to fall apart, and I forced my hands to stay steady, to keep from betraying me with the tremors I could already feel gathering. My fingers brushed the worn wool, and it felt prickly cold not from the temperature, but from the heavy silence behind me where Silas McCord stood. I didn't turn around, but I could feel the tension in every muscle in his body, as though the entire room were pulled tight by an invisible wire. He stood there, his shadow falling long across the wooden floor, his broad shoulders built to withstand a harsh winter, yet today they sagged under an invisible weight. In his hand was a letter, the paper folded once, but with a slight tear at the edge, like it had been gripped too hard. I'd caught a glimpse of it earlier, and I already knew what it was. I didn't have to ask, didn't need him to say it. Bank papers, those cold, metallic-smelling notices that always carried the sting of threat, like the sound of nails being driven into a coffin. I'd gotten used to keeping my world small, my life contained within a handful of repeated chores, safe and quiet enough that I could exist without drawing attention. I lived like someone walking on thin ice, always avoiding curious eyes, avoiding needless questions most of all, avoiding strange hands. My own hands, marked with long scars, carried a past I never wanted anyone to see. They were a constant reminder that I didn't belong at lively gatherings, didn't belong in anyone's embrace, didn't belong in the promise of a real home. Silas said nothing for a long while, but his silence weighed heavier than shouting. I heard the faint rustle of paper as he opened the letter again, his eyes surely tracing every word, words I guessed he already knew by heart from the first reading. Then he folded it back, not with the carelessness of someone ready to let go, but with the slow, deliberate stiffness of folding a flag over a coffin, precise, restrained, and yet holding a desperation that couldn't be hidden. He took a deep breath, the sound heavy, like a fire about to go out. When he spoke, his voice cracked like glass under pressure, a sound that didn't match his towering frame or solid stance. The bank says I need a wife to keep this land. The words dropped into the air like a sentence, and I felt my blood rush the wrong way, my heart pounding so hard I thought he might hear it. I kept my head down, my eyes fixed on the half-folded blanket, willing my hands to keep moving, because I knew if I stopped, I might shatter. The blanket felt like a thin shield now, something between me and the thing I knew I couldn't face. My heartbeat mixed with the faint crackle of the wood in the hearth, and every breath I took felt heavier. I'm your housekeeper, not your bride, Mr. McCord. My voice came out dry, as brittle as the desert outside where the wind carried sand that cut into the skin, leaving stinging marks that never bled. Every word was an effort to keep my distance, to protect what little I still had from being swept into a storm I knew would consume me. The firelight cast his shadow in sharp, shifting shapes on the wall, and though I didn't turn around, I knew his eyes were searching me, looking for a crack in my resolve. But I gripped the blanket tighter, feeling the heat flare along my scars, as if they were warning me. I couldn't open my world wider, not when I knew the moment I did, I'd have nowhere left to hide. Find someone else, I added, softer this time. But each word fell heavy, landing between us and creating a distance that couldn't be crossed. And in that moment, I heard the wind howl outside, the sound of the wide, harsh land vast, unforgiving, and I knew, whether or not he found someone else, The real storm was already here, in this room, between two people who couldn't and wouldn't reach for each other. The grandfather clock on the wall ticked with a steady rhythm, each beat pounding against my temples, too clear, too loud, as if the hands weren't just measuring time, but slicing through every taut nerve in the room. Silas stepped closer, each footfall heavy, stopping right in front of the fireplace. The firelight flickered across his face, and I could feel the warmth radiating from his body close enough to breathe in, but it still wasn't enough to chase away the cold that had sunk deep into my chest, the kind that came from inside, not from the snowstorm outside. His voice dropped lower, as if trying to soften it, but every word still carried the weight of tightly pressed desperation. "There's no one else. Not here. Not with the snow this deep and the roads blocked until spring. I've only got 30 days. He let out a sigh, not of relief, but the kind that seemed to drain months of exhaustion from his bones. After that, they'll take the land. Slowly, I turned to face him. My eyes, black as wet stone, held no fear, no warmth, only the caution that had been carved into me after years of never knowing if tomorrow would still be safe. My cheekbones stood sharp beneath my dark skin, my lips pressed into a thin line, cold and unmoving like an old scar. "Why me?" I asked, each word thrown like a test. He met my gaze without blinking, without flinching, as if there was no space left between us for evasions. "Because you're already here, and because I trust you with Jeb." My chest tightened at the sound of the boy's name. Jeb, his son, the child who had lost his mother, whose wide eyes always seemed to be searching for something that would never return. I was the only one in this land who could take care of him, even if I didn't want to, even if I had never willingly carried another life on my back. Silas had placed a weight on my shoulders I knew I couldn't set down. Outside, the wind howled through the cracks in the doorframe, carrying with it the sharp scent of fresh snow. Inside the small room, the grandfather clock kept ticking, steady and unyielding, counting down the days until everything would be gone. I looked at Silas, said nothing, but felt the invisible cord tightening between us, a cord that bound, that threatened, and would not let me go. A long silence stretched between us. The stew in the pot bubbled quietly, while a strong gust of wind outside rattled the window. Finally, I ladled some stew into a bowl and set it on the table, then walked past him. My boots were heavy on the wooden floor. I opened the back door and stepped out into the snow, knee-deep, kneeling beside a pile of firewood and tying them together with a thin leather thong. Silas followed me to the door but didn't say anything. I returned a few minutes later, carrying a full armload of firewood, my eyes unreadable. "I don't take pity," I said, brushing past him. He nodded, not arguing. Instead, he reached behind the armchair by the fireplace and pulled out a bundle. It was an old navy blue wool coat, lined with sheepskin, the buttons tarnished. He placed it over the back of my chair. "For carrying coal." I looked at the coat but didn't touch it. "I have my own," I said, but didn't push it away. From outside, faint voices carried on the wind, laughter, then a hateful murmur. "He's gonna marry a Comanche, you hear?" Both Silas and I heard it. I didn't flinch, but my eyes darted toward the window. My voice was steady when I spoke again. "They'll burn your barn for this." "I'll build a new one," he replied. I sat down slowly. The fire crackled behind me. Silas took a plate of cornbread from the table and gently placed it beside my bowl of stew. I stared at it for a long moment. Then, without a word, I tore off a piece, dipped it in the broth, and ate. He sat opposite me, elbows on the table. Our eyes met across the firelight. I swallowed the cornbread, whispering almost to myself, "I'll think about it." Silas nodded somberly. "That's enough for now." Outside, the snow was falling more thickly. The fire warmed the walls, and for a moment in this kitchen at the end of the world, there was no war, no scars, no laws to divide us. Only two survivors waiting to see if they could build something from the ashes. 3 days later, the wind had died down, but the cold still clung to my skin like a patient predator. I woke before the sun. The cabin was still in darkness, but I felt the silence was no longer as heavy as it had been. I made oatmeal, its smell filling the kitchen, then quietly put on another thin wool shirt. Silas had gone out early, and I preferred that. Since his strange proposal, I had tried to avoid prolonged glances, to avoid those moments of too much quiet when we were the only two in a room. I hadn't said yes, nor had I said no, but I had stayed. For now, that was enough. I took my tools out to the back fence. A few wooden rails had collapsed under the weight of the recent snowstorm. I knelt in the cold snow, my calloused hands beginning to work. With crude leather strips, I began to tie the crisscrossing knots my grandfather had taught me so long ago, before he was taken away. The knots of the Comanche were made to last through storms and through cruel men. I worked in silence and with efficiency, every movement deliberate, with no wasted effort. From the corral, I felt Silas's gaze. I knew he was watching me. He didn't say anything, just stood there, silently. He had once been a man of words, but now he was a man of silence, of small actions. There was something about the way I worked, a stubborn self-reliance that made him both admire and ache. He carried a bucket of water across the snow to the horses. "They need you too," he said, not looking at me. I didn't answer. I just tightened the last leather strip and moved to the next wooden rail, but my eyes flickered to him once, then looked away. Behind the barn, the sound of hooves rang out. A man in a black coat on the back of a chestnut horse slowly approached the fence. His face was narrow, his beard neatly trimmed, too clean for a rancher. He was a bounty hunter, or worse, an enforcer. He said nothing, just leisurely tied his reins to the fence and pulled out a small knife. He drew it slowly along the top rail, leaving a shallow, deliberate gash. I felt my chest tighten. Silas stepped up, standing between me and the man. "Lost, are you?" he asked, his voice low and cold. The man gave a dry laugh. "Just admiring your property, Ward. Looks like the kind that won't be yours for long." "There's nothing for sale here," Silas said. The man sneered, tipped his hat, then rode off. The gash on the fence remained, a wordless threat. I stared at it, my expression unreadable. That night, after Jeb had gone to sleep, I returned from the barn with an armload of firewood. My fingers were red and numb from the cold. I silently lit a fire. Silas sat across from me, carving a piece of pine wood. When I placed the pot of stew on the table, he stood up, went outside without a word. He returned a few minutes later, carrying a hammer and a chisel. In the faint light of the lantern, he approached the worn barn door. On the topmost plank, just above the latch, he began to carve a small five-pointed star. The chisel strikes were even and slow into the grain of the wood. I watched him from the kitchen window. When he was finished, he stepped back, giving a single nod. "So you don't get lost," he said softly. I felt something melt in my chest. The next morning, I woke before dawn. I made porridge and placed a bowl on his workbench in the barn, next to a small paper napkin, carefully written, "For your boy." By afternoon, the wind had changed, carrying with it an air of tension. Silas returned from town, his shoulders rigid, his teeth gritted. The bank had sent another letter, this time brief and to the point. But when he entered the barn, he stopped. There, on the saddle rack, his late wife's old coat was hanging. It was no longer folded, but carefully hung on a hook, the sleeves dusted, the collar mended meticulously. I stood beside it, trying it on. The navy blue wool settled over my shoulders as if it belonged there. I turned around and saw him looking. Our eyes met. This time, I didn't look away. There was no warmth, not yet, but there was no coldness either, just something cautious, something that was considering. He gave a single nod. I didn't smile, but I didn't frown either. I stood tall, the coat embracing me like armor. I walked past him slowly, my boots solid on the wooden floor, and for the first time in weeks, the barn didn't feel so empty. The sun had not yet risen when I realized something was wrong. The barn door was ajar. The silence was too deep. Jeb's usual tiny footsteps were not ringing out. I called his name once, then again, no answer. The wooden spoon slid from my hand and fell to the floor. Outside, small, hurried, and solitary footprints led from the porch. I quickly grabbed my shawl, tied my hunting knife beneath it, and ran after them. The forest was thick right behind the gorge, where the tangled pines stood tall and silent. My breath formed white clouds. Twigs snapped under my boots. Then a weak cry rang out. "Mama!" It was Jeb's voice. I ran with all my might. I found him cornered in a thicket, his eyes wide with terror. A small streak of blood ran from his ankle, where he had stumbled. Around him were 3 snarling wolves, one of which had already begun to stalk. Without hesitation, I whistled, a high and sharp note, then threw a handful of snow at the nearest animal. They flinched, freezing in place. I stood between Jeb and the wolves, my knife drawn, in a low stance. "Get back," I growled in Comanche. The wolves hesitated. One lunged. I made a slash through the air, sharp and decisive, just enough to graze its snout and make it flinch. With a growl from my throat, I grabbed a burning branch from a fallen tree nearby and waved it wildly. The fire hissed. The wolves scattered into the thicket, growling as they disappeared into the woods. I knelt down, my heart pounding. "You're safe now," I whispered, wrapping Jeb in my shawl. Blood had seeped through his sock, but he was still breathing. His small hands clung to me, his face buried against me. Silas arrived a few minutes later, rifle in hand, his eyes wild. "Jeb," I stood up, holding the boy in my arms. I found him. Silas ran to me, taking the boy into his arms. He stiffened when he saw my torn sleeve. The frayed fabric had been pulled back, revealing a rough, discolored scar, burned deep into my upper arm. A single word. The scar was made by a clumsy but deliberate hand, ugly and permanent. His voice cracked. "Who did that to you?" I pulled my shawl up slowly. My eyes met his. Not with anger, not with shame. "I survived," I said simply. He didn't speak, didn't move, just looked at me as if he were seeing me for the first time. That night, whispers spread throughout the town. One ranch hand said I had driven off a pack of wolves with just a knife and fire. Another said I bore scars from my time as a Comanche captive. Yet another said I was magic. "She's dangerous," they mumbled. "She's not natural. She was once property. She could betray him." At the ranch, I sat quietly by the fireplace, carving a small wooden charm. My hands only trembled slightly. My knife moved carefully, shaping the delicate curves of a wolf's head. I hung it on the entrance of the ranch, just above Jeb's reach. Silas watched from the barn. Later that evening, he walked into the kitchen, placing a neatly folded handkerchief on the edge of my sleeping place. "For your hands," he whispered. I looked at it, then at him. There was a silence. Then I nodded. Just a slight nod. The next morning, he found the fence near the boy's favorite path marked with shallow carvings, spirals and arrows, the protective symbols of my people. Beneath them were my initials, small and steady. That night, when the wind carried the distant howls over the hills, Silas stood beside me under the moonlight. I didn't flinch when he came closer. "You're more than just a housekeeper," he said, his voice low. I didn't answer, but I turned my head slowly and our eyes met, not with uncertainty, not with caution, for the first time. I didn't smile, but I didn't turn away either. The contract was signed in silence. There was no church, no vows, no witnesses other than the wind whistling through the window. Silas and I sat across from a county clerk in Deadwood Creek, a man who wouldn't look us in the eye as he stamped the seal. Afterwards, we rode back in the same wagon. Jeb slept curled up under a blanket in the back, unaware that his father had just taken a wife, or that the woman who had always worried about him now shared his family name. That night, in the kitchen, I moved with a quiet grace. I stirred a pot of soup with one hand, while with the other, I showed Jeb how to create a fire with flint and dry grass. He clapped excitedly as the first sparks ignited. "Remember to breathe," I whispered. "Not too fast. The fire needs to trust you." Silas stood in the doorway, arms crossed, leaning against the frame. A strange warmth filled his chest, something like pride, something like home. But the peace was short-lived in Deadwood Creek. The next day, just before sunset, smoke billowed into the sky from behind the barn. Silas ran out first, rifle in hand. I followed with a bucket. The fire was licking at a pile of dry grass stacked by the fence, small but fierce. A broken lantern lay nearby. The knife gash from days before now had black scorch marks next to it. The fire was quickly put out, Silas using his coat to smother the flames, while I hurled water with a trained force. Our hands touched once on the handle of the bucket, our fingers gliding through the steam and soot. Neither of us pulled away. When it was over, the barn was still standing, but only barely. Silas swore under his breath. He said he'd do it, he growled. Said he'd burn what he couldn't buy. I looked toward town. He'll be back? Silas nodded. If the bank keeps pushing, yes. I wrapped my arms around myself. Later, in the quiet of the evening, Silas placed a bundle beside my sleeping place. It was a thin, braided leather strip. I touched it gently. "Did you make this?" "I cut it from an old bridle," he said. I nodded, a wordless thank you. The next morning, Silas found a small plate on his workbench in the barn, still warm, covered with a cloth. Underneath was a piece of cornbread, buttered and golden. A small paper scrap, carefully written, "For your heart." That night, I stood by the fireplace, my hands free. "Do you want to know how I got this scar?" I said, my voice low. Silas turned back from the window. "I figured you'd tell me when you were ready." I nodded slowly. "I was 13. My village was raided at night. They didn't ask. They just took what they wanted. Horses, blankets, children. I was small, strong, easy to move. They sold me to a man near the Texas border. He branded me, after I tried to run away once. I pulled up my sleeve just enough to show the burned, raised letters. He called me little girl, never by name. When he died, others passed me around until I found a way to run for good." My voice trembled. Some days I can still smell the burning iron. Silas walked slowly across the room. He reached for my hand. I flinched, then let him take it. "You are not anyone's property," he said with finality. "Not now. Not ever." My fingers tightened around his, and then, to my surprise, I started to cry. Silent, fierce tears streamed down my cheeks. He said nothing more, just stood there with me, as the fire blazed and the storm outside began to draw closer. I knelt by the fireplace, humming a soft melody from my lips as I stirred the stew. Jeb sat cross-legged at my feet, mimicking the rhythm. His small voice sang along to the tune I had taught him, an old Comanche lullaby shaped by wind and memory. "Again?" he asked, his face beaming. I nodded. "One more time, but slower this time." Let the song breathe. Outside, Silas was hammering a new brace into the barn door. His sleeves were rolled up, his jaw set in a quiet concentration. Each hammer blow rang out like a heartbeat across the yard. Behind him, the scar from the fire still blackened part of the fence, a reminder of how close we had come to losing everything. But his mind was somewhere else. He had received word that the bank was sending someone, a lawyer, to verify the legality of the marriage. The signed papers were not enough. They wanted proof, a witness, a solid affirmation. That night, Silas stood by his desk, a pen in his hand. Under the lantern light, he began to write. "To whom it may concern, I, Silas McCord, declare Alara McCord to be not only my lawful wife, but the woman who has held this land together." The words started hesitant, then grew more firm. He was writing not for bureaucracy, but for truth, for himself, and for me. Unseen by him, I stood in the doorway, watching. I said nothing, but my eyes lingered on his script, on the careful way he furrowed his brow. Something shifted in me then, not like a breaking, but a quiet, tender stillness, like coming home. The next morning, I found the front door frame sanded smooth, with fresh chisel marks just above the latch. The name El Ara was carved in capital letters. He walked past me as I was running my fingers over the carving. "For my wife," he said simply, then walked away. I did not follow. But later, while Jeb was sleeping, I took one of the leather laces he liked to play with, braided it into a small loop, and gently hung it around his neck. "For our son," I whispered, stroking his hair. When the lawyer came, he did not come alone. Cutter rode behind him, arms crossed, his lips curled in that half-smile I had come to fear. Silas met them at the gate. The lawyer adjusted his gloves. "We need to have a little chat, Mr. McCord, about your arrangement." Silas did not flinch. "There's no arrangement here. Elara is my wife." The man's eyebrows shot up. "The timing is convenient." Silas stepped aside, gesturing to the porch. I came out, holding Jeb's hand. My long braids were loose on my shoulders, and my eyes were steady. Silas turned to me, then gently took my hand. "She is not here for the land," he said, his voice low but firm. "She is here because she is the only part of this place that feels like home." I looked at him, my eyes wide, not with fear, but with something close to astonishment. I squeezed his hand. The lawyer cleared his throat. "Is this what you want, ma'am?" I lifted my chin. "I chose this home. I chose him." A silence fell. Then the lawyer nodded, made a note in his ledger, and motioned for Cutter to leave. Later, as the sun set, staining the ranch in shades of copper, Silas stood beside me on the porch. No one said anything, but the land felt quieter, less burdened, as if the last gust of wind had decided to leave us be. The fire started just after sunset. Silas smelled the smoke first, sharp and bitter, not like burning wood. Then came Jeb's cry from the kitchen. "Fire!" He ran for the door, rifle already in hand, his heart pounding as he saw the south fence ablaze, flames dancing in a cruel, straight line across the dry wooden posts. Behind them, figures moved quickly, on horseback, retreating toward the road. One rider lingered long enough to toss a match and sneer. I was faster than him. I tore through the porch, my braids flying behind me, a bucket in each hand. No fear, no hesitation. I knelt at the edge of the fire, scooping up snow and dirt with practiced movements. My voice rang out with sharp commands, Comanche words he had never heard. I moved like one born to fire. Silas joined me, throwing buckets of water, snatching a blanket from the clothesline and beating at the flames. Behind us, neighbors arrived, some on horseback, some with shovels. The townspeople, who days ago wouldn't meet my eyes, now stood shoulder to shoulder, stomping out the fire with heavy boots. Together, we fought the fire. When it was over, I stood alone in the field, smoke swirling around me. My dress was singed, my hands black with ash, but I stood tall, my chest heaving with slow, steady breaths. Silas walked up to me, his blood still hot with rage. Cutter stood at the edge of the fence, arms crossed, a look of smug satisfaction on his face. "You'll lose more than the fence if you keep hiding behind her." Silas stepped forward, rifle raised, not aimed, but close enough. "You start one more fire on my land, and you won't ride out of here again." The man spat, then turned his horse, and galloped away into the night. When silence returned, the townspeople lingered. One woman walked up, placing a bucket at my feet. "You're braver than most of us," she said. I looked at her, uncertain, but the woman nodded. "Now we've seen it." That night, I sat by the fireplace, mending Silas's shirt. My fingers moved slowly over the frayed fabric, patching it with a piece of soft blue cloth. I folded it neatly and placed it at the end of his sleeping place. "For your warmth," I wrote on a small piece of paper tucked into the collar. Upstairs, on the small table by my bed, Silas had left a jar of wildflowers, dry but still colorful. "For our home," the note read. Later, when the moon was high, casting silver light over the land, I walked outside. I didn't wear a shawl. The scar on my arm, branded and raised, was bare under the moonlight. The townspeople had gathered by the fence, waiting. I walked to them. My heart pounded. "I used to be a thing," I said, my voice steady, branded like an animal, passed between men like a coin. I paused, but I survived. I am not property. I am not a shame. I am a woman. And this land is my choice. A silence fell. Then, one by one, heads nodded. One person clapped. Others followed. Silas walked to my side. Without a word, he wrapped his arms around me. "You're not my thing," he whispered. "You're my home." I closed my eyes, resting my forehead on his shoulder. And under the moonlight, in front of strangers who now understood, we stood together, no longer housekeeper and rancher, no longer runaway and widower, but something else entirely, something whole. The snow melted slowly that year, retreating like a tired soldier. By early April, soft green shoots had broken through the hard ground near the porch. I was the first to wake each morning. Knees on the dirt, hands guiding seeds into the soil, carrots, onions, pumpkins. I moved with a quiet purpose, sleeves rolled up, hair loose under the warm sun. Silas watched me from the porch, a hammer in his hand. He was building a rocking chair from the leftover oak rails, smoothing each edge as if he were shaping more than just wood. By late afternoon, the frame was complete. He set it facing east, where the sun hit the fence first. The chair creaked as he tested it. It held. Jeb ran past both of us, barefoot and yelling with delight. "Mama, come see the lizard." I looked up, brushing dirt from my fingers. "What kind?" "A fast one." I smiled and followed. Silas's eyes lingered on the way Jeb took my hand without a second thought, as if it had always belonged there. That weekend, the townspeople started to come. 2 by 2, then 3. A bag of flour, a spool of thread, a hand-embroidered shawl with red flowers. "For the bride," they said shyly, offering the gifts. I accepted them all with a nod and a small smile, my shoulders no longer tense, my eyes no longer wary. The fence had been burned, but the wall between me and the town had also come down. The wedding happened without an announcement, without a preacher, just a circle of friends by the river behind the corral, the trees just beginning to bud a soft green. I wore a simple cotton dress I had sewn myself, tied with a leather thong. Silas wore his best shirt, still bearing the patches I had mended months ago. Jeb stood between us, holding both our hands. A friend from town read a blessing, and we exchanged words that were not for ceremony but for truth. "I saw you," Silas said, his voice low. "Not when you came here, but when you stayed." My voice did not tremble. "You gave me a name I chose, not a name I had to survive." We kissed, gently and without haste, with the river singing behind us. That night, I placed a thin braided leather strip on the back of the new rocking chair on the porch. A small carving was marked in the center, 3 intertwined lines. "The Comanche symbol for family, for our family," the note read. Silas found it at dawn. He said nothing, just sat down in the chair, his hands on the leather, and breathed. Then, when I walked past, he reached out and took my hand. "You're my land," he whispered, "the only thing I'll fight to keep." I smiled, a full and radiant smile. That night, under a full spring moon, we laughed, truly laughed, for the first time. Not because the past was gone, but because it had finally found its place, behind us. A horse whinnied in the distance. The wind picked up, but it was warm, and the light on the porch stayed on long after we had gone inside. By midsummer, the ranch had settled into a peace that neither Silas nor I had ever truly believed possible. The silence between us was no longer heavy with hesitation or grief. It had become soothing, a stillness that comes only when the worst is over, and there is nothing left but growth. The fields, once parched and brittle from the winter, now spread out in a deep green. The wheat swayed gently in the breeze, and stubborn new cornstalks rose from the black earth. The fences had been rebuilt, not just repaired, but made stronger, with posts driven deep and sealed carefully. Every plank held the memory of the shared effort of our neighbors. The strangers who once viewed me with suspicion now greeted me with nods, with hot loaves of bread, and with laughter. The house had changed too. The paint was peeling in a few places, but there was a pride in every plank. I had braided a wind chime from bone, feathers, and copper I had found by the river, and hung it beside the porch door. Its sound was not loud, but when the wind rose, it filled the air with something ancient and sacred. Along the path to the corral, I had planted wild flowers. The blue was like the deepest part of the sky. The yellow was like prairie fire. The soft purple was like crushed petals. They grew riotously and freely, not in neat rows, but in a glorious mess, just as my childhood memories had bloomed. Jeb called them Mama's colors and picked bouquets each morning, leaving them in unexpected places. On my pillow, in Silas's boot, beside the water bucket, above the front gate, Silas had carved a new sign from thick cedar. The letters were bold, sure, and clear. Ward Haven. Beside the name, he had carved a 5-pointed star. It was the same shape he had once carved on the barn door in the middle of winter, when I was still just a watchful housekeeper, and he was a man buried in silence. That star had once been a sign of direction. Now, it was a sign of arrival. That morning, I stood by the window, sunlight painting soft shapes on the wooden floor. In my hand was a quilt sewn not just with thread, but with time. It bore the symbols of my people, horses running with the wind, suns that never set, rivers that remembered. Each square was a part of my journey. In a corner of the quilt, I tied a small piece of leather and gently placed it on Jeb's bed. For our son. That afternoon, a wagon rattled down the road from Deadwood Creek. The lawyer stepped out, this time not with questions or caution, but with a certificate in his hand, legal, final, and true. The land was ours. The marriage was recognized. There would be no more riders, no more threats. The news traveled fast, and by sunset, the porch was full of neighbors. Someone passed around a jug of apple cider. The children ran barefoot through the yard. My cornbread disappeared from the table in minutes, and someone asked for the recipe. As dusk settled, I walked out. I wore the simple cotton dress I had sewn for our riverside wedding. The wind gently tugged at my braids as I faced the crowd. Without fanfare, I reached up and pulled back my sleeve. The scar, black and brutal, ran across my upper arm. It had once branded me as a lesser thing, a thing to be owned, a past broken, but I now exposed it openly. This scar, I said, my voice steady, is my story, and it brought me home. For a moment, there was only the sound of the wind through the wheat field. Then one person clapped, then another, then the whole porch was filled with applause. It wasn't pity, it wasn't curiosity, it was respect. Silas walked to me, took my hand, and gently touched the scar with his thumb. "Her home," he whispered. That night, under a star-filled sky, Silas and I stood in the field, our arms wrapped around each other. The air was warm with the promise of summer. The wildflowers swayed to a rhythm, and the moon painted silver onto the land we had fought to keep, not with bullets, but with courage. "You tamed my heart," Silas murmured. I leaned closer, my lips brushing his collarbone. "No," I said, soft as a prayer. We found it together, far away behind the trees. A wolf howled, low, long, and without fear. It wasn't a warning, it was a song, and just above the gate, the wooden sign caught the moonlight. Ward Haven, built on love.